Good afternoon, everyone, colleagues, students, friends. Welcome to Columbia University. My name is Qing Gao. I'm a faculty member at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and also the director of the China Center for Social Policy at Columbia University. Welcome to all of you, both in person and online, to our event today. For the past several years, Professor Yao Lu of Sociology and I have been organizing a lecture series every year. This year's lecture series is titled Labor Force Transformations in China. And it's most befitting that today we have Professor Wang Feng to give us a book talk to conclude this lecture series this year. As many of you know, Professor Wang Feng is one of the most renowned sociologists and demographers of his generation. He's a professor of sociology at UC Irvine, and for nearly 4 decades, Professor Wang has studied global population shifts and policies and social inequalities in China. Most notably, his academic research and public advocacy has played a critical role in the overturning of the decades-old one-child policy in China. Professor Wang has published over 100 articles and 11 books. He has also served as an expert for the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum. Earlier this month, Professor Wang won the Guggenheim Fellowship, one of the most prestigious awards to those who have demonstrated exceptional capacity for productive scholarship and exceptional creativity in the arts. He's the only sociologist who won this great honor this year. Please join me to congratulate Professor Wang on this great achievement. To me personally, to host Professor Wang today is very meaningful. For over 15 years, he has been a great mentor, friend, and most recently, a collaborator to me. He has always been a wise counsel and a steadfast support to me. I've been always so deeply grateful to him and greatly inspired by him. So today, Professor Wang will share with us his new book, China's Age of Abundance. It's a sweeping history of China's economic reform period, and it will certainly be a treat for all of us today. Professor Wang will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will engage in a conversation. Thank you and welcome, Professor Wang.
Thank you, Gao Jing, for this most generous introduction. I'm so privileged to be here to share this book. I think it's a memoir of our common travels with many of the people here. And I can say the same thing to quite a few people in this audience who have been mentors, supporters, enablers of the work that I have been lucky to do. So should I move over there? Okay, so thank you.
People online can't see. You have to go through
Zoom. And here. Perfect. Mm-hmm. Go back. Okay, right. All right. Good afternoon again. I'm here to share some of the contents of the book that just came out with Cambridge University. The title is the same as the title here. Let me say a few words about how the book came about and why I worked on this book. I think, first of all, we have to give not credit, but recognizing the COVID-19 lockdown. And I used to travel frequently to China 5 times a year, but COVID put a stop on that. And so that actually provided opportunity to focus and then to be forced at home to do a writing project. So this is the writing project. And the other reason is, as I look at myself as someone who has been so lucky to have really witnessed this spectacular 4 decades of economic and social transformations in this largest country in China. So aside from the population work that I've done with colleagues here, I've been thinking about 2 things. One is what's the best way to document what happened in the last 4 decades? And connected to that, the second question is, how did that happen? So these are the 2 questions in my mind when I set out to do this. So I have to say, one of the purpose is really writing this book, not so much about sharing the reflections with people perhaps in this room, but writing this for future generations when they look back at this period, and what would they look at? So we've seen the nightmare book in my mind is a book about Chinese reform and opening policies, documenting all the policies, and also documenting per capita GDP and the huge investment, the money spent, and those things would not make too much sense for the people in the future. I think for them is to look at how the ordinary people, how their lives have changed. So their standard of living have transformed. So that is one major component of the book. It's about this age of abundance. Talk about how 1/5 of the world population moved from a life of on the verge of poverty to an age of abundance. So that's one major motivation to write about this book. That's in the chapter 3 of the book. And the other chapters are really about how did this happen, right? And I'll walk this through with you. So to begin, we have to go back to 40 years ago to look at standard of living on the eve of this economic takeoff. I think for some of us here in this room, these coupons from grain to matches and to pork and all look very familiar. So what's happening is stunning that on the eve of this economic takeoff in the late 1970s, the average nutritional intake for the average Chinese was not much better than what it was in the early 1950s or even in the 1930s. The difference was a more equitable distribution. So that prevented large-scale starvation and famine. And if we recall what happened during the Great Leap Forward famine, human mistakes plus natural disasters could set a large share of the population below starvation line and to death, right? So here, if we look from 1950s to 1978, there's hardly much improvement in the grain per capita and the vegetable oil consumption. So we have all sorts of measures to document what kind of material poverty that was prevalent prior to this age of abundance. The Chinese have a saying that is the food, well, people take food as the heaven, right? 民以食为天. So the abundance began by having more to eat. And here, after 1978, in 5 years only, grain output increased by 30%, right? And other consumption in terms of food, consumption items increased here by percentage. And not surprisingly, when people had more grain to eat, more fish, more eggs, and they start to drink more. So this is the liquor consumption from 78 to 92. Look at how rapidly that increased, right? And there are many measures I document in the book, from coffee as consumption to tobacco. But one that stands out is dairy product, right? 90% of Chinese are lactose intolerant. And China now is the largest importer of dairy products in the world, including cheese, right? So people are not only eating more, they're eating better, right? There's no better measure to document the improvements in standard living than the height of the population, right? So here we have two charts. One to the left is of the 7-year-old, and this is for 15-year-old. So just look at the 7-year-old. In 2 decades, from 1992, this is when children started to have things to eat in the late 1980s, and to 2012. Oops, yeah. Where's the, oh, yeah. In 2 decades, the average height of 7-year-old Chinese, especially those in the countryside, increased by about 8 centimeters. Okay, so that's about 4 centimeters per decade. What does that mean? Historical comparison would show in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, the average gain in height during this industrialization process is about 2 centimeters per decade. So the Chinese were growing taller at the pace about twice the speed of the other comparisons. And what's most striking is the last one. These are the girls in the countryside. Look at the gap at the beginning, right? This is the gap at the beginning. And the rural girl was how many centimeters shorter than those in the in cities and compared with boys. But by the by 2012, the height of rural girls gained the most in terms of height. So for those who may not know this, travel to China often, I think 40 years ago, 30 years ago, you could tell a person's from the countryside. Now from the appearance, that height difference has also been greatly shrunk, especially for girls. So these are just some of the measures of showing the, what we call the age of abundance. And then the list continues. It's not what just people have to eat, but also what people have to wear, right? I took this from online. I didn't, no. The other pictures, I took them, some of this with Taiyong when we went to Jiangsu to do our surveys. In 1978, on average, 3 persons in rural China bought 1 pair of shoes. Okay. It's not to say they only wore 1 pair of shoes or 1/3 of a pair. Many rural households made their own shoes, so they had shoes to wear. But for the whole country, the per capita shoe purchased was 1 pair. Socks, 1.3, and then 1 pair of underwear for the whole year, for the whole country. By 2015, China exported 3.5 billion pairs of shoes. So more than way more than half of the world population outside of China could wear a pair of shoes that's made in China, right? Moreover, it's not just shoes and clothing, but luxury goods, right? By the late 2010s, the Chinese spending on luxury goods far outpaced the per capita income ranking or the share of the population, right? And so China now is not only a land of just producing clothing, but also fashion and the luxury. There are other measures of improvement in standard of living, and this is all recorded in the book. So now I want to shift to the second part, that is how do we make sense of what happened in the last 40 years. I want to begin by showing you this picture. This is an art piece. I took this picture from the Netsu Museum in Tokyo because it's so lovely. It's the elephant, it's the blind man touching the elephant. So I want to show this to you because I want to say what I discuss here is I'm just one of the blind men. Okay, I don't claim I have all the answers. I can give you a comprehensive story, but we're all trying. So these are the four narratives we hear often on what really happened this last 4 years. One is that China is unique. China is very different. There's a China model, right? The second is very common, that China's growth relied on cheap labor. China had abundant supply of cheap labor. The third one was China got to where it is because of 改革开放, reform and opening. So this is all government policy, government initiative. And I'm not dismissing the role of these institutional changes. They are absolutely crucial. But I think the prevailing narrative privileges 改革开放. You still hear about this, right? With economic slowdown these days, everybody is saying, oh, we need more 改革, we need more opening, right? How is that going to work, right? The last one, again, is this self-confidence that the Chinese growth, this era of China's age of abundance, was going to happen anyway. It was preordained, and therefore it's also irreversible. So these are the four narratives. Is China unique? First, let's look at the path to abundance, what I call. So the Chinese path to abundance began with more food to eat, right? In less than 10 years, just one measure, per capita consumption of cooking oil increased by 350%, right? So people start to eat better. And then what happens is you live better. So there are other measures, but among them are the saturation of color TVs in urban and rural households. And also in urban households, the saturation of air conditioners. So people are living better. So when you have better food, better clothing, better housing, what do you do next? Automobiles, right? So starting from the mid 2000s, and we see automobile ownership per 100 households increased by 1,200%, 12 times. And then what do you do? After you have automobiles, you start to travel abroad, right? So starting from, again, late 2010s up to the pandemic, we see six-fold increase just in a few years in overseas travels. Most of these were for private sightseeing, for vacation holidays. So in terms of how people improve their lives, the Chinese path is no different from other human beings elsewhere. But this is not the end of the story of Chinese uniqueness, right? We'll talk about this more. Now I shift to the second narrative, that the Chinese economic growth relied on cheap labor. Now, Professor Qin Hui here has done great work what is cheap labor. What I call here is China had not cheap labor, but good labor and made cheap, right? Here I need to acknowledge, as in many other places, of Cai Yong, who helped me to do this complex graph. So the plot here is in 1976, okay, 1976, the relationship between a health measure that's under 5 mortality here and per capita income in log form. So this is the global pattern. And in China, with its very low income, had a child mortality level that was much, much below. It was at the level of upper middle income societies. So in terms of health, and that shows the life expectancy increase. So under socialism, this is mostly not through improved diet that much, unlike what happened afterwards. It's through public health. Okay, so in the book, in chapter 2, I talk about this. So clearly China was an outlier, and you cannot just look at income, you look at health. So China had a healthy population to begin with. So it's not just cheap. And health is not just important for physical labor, but also for cognition, for learning, right? And at the same time, China was also a global outlier prior to the reform era in terms of literacy. Now, this is not fancy education. It just, this shows the same plotting with all the countries that we had data at that time, 100 plus. Income and secondary school female enrollment. And again, China was much higher than the global pattern. It's outlier. So in other words, on the eve of economic takeoff, China had a labor that's healthy and is literate. This is very important, literacy, right? However, they also had another legacy, which is one country, two systems, right? China had an industrialization prior to 1978. By the late 1970s, nearly half of Chinese economic output was from the industrial sector. But you look at, while industrialization took place, this is what happened with urbanization. Now, how did China do this? I think a lot of people here know this so well. It's through the hukou system to build the Chinese industrialization on the backs of Chinese peasants, 80% of the population. And there are all different sorts of estimates about the implicit tax, about the resources extracted from the countryside to fund the that phase of urbanization without industrialization without urbanization. So what this system created was also to subject 80% of the population to a much worse level of material poverty, scarcity. So after the decollectivization, after the increase in food products, what happened is in the 1990s, the farmers in the countryside started to use their labor and their income, their capital to engage in non-farming activities, right? So a lot of studies have done work like especially Yasheng Huang's work and also Jin Oil, and on the role of township and the village enterprises. So here's what I want to make a point in this book, is that people wrote about the TVEs and then they stopped writing about it. And then people started to write about migration. So what I want to just remind people is they are the same people, right? So before they could go into the cities to build up the cities, and they started to use their time and energy and income to carry out non-farming work in the countryside. And here I have measures to show the contribution of TVEs in terms of the overall industrial output and also employment. And this is very important. At the peak of China's export economy, that's around after the financial crisis, about 30% of China's GDP was from export. But the export boom began in the 1990s from 10% to over 20%. And if you look at during this period, what source drove export boom, it was rural industry, the contribution from rural industries. So in other words, if you look at what people wore, clothing and small other toys and all sorts of products, and they were all made in the countryside by this township and village enterprises. And I think this is in the mid 1990s, 50% of all exports were from these rural industries, right? And then you have the second phase. In the 1990s, you have the sharp increase in migrants going into cities. And then after the Olympics, you have another huge peak into the cities. So why it happened in the 1990s? There was both the push from the countryside, what happened after 1989 with the policies toward hostile policies toward TVEs. And then you have the pull, that is, you don't need Liang Piao anymore after the beginning of the 1990s. Those coupons were abandoned. So you could move into cities, and also the urban reforms, especially housing reforms, created opportunities for the construction. So you have the same people who manufactured, engaged in non-farming production in the countryside, moved into cities. So this is the footprint we follow of the 80% of the population in the countryside, from industrialization in situ to migration to the cities. Talk about wealth and abundance, there's not a single path. So there are two paths, one of the migrant labor, migrants, and the other of urban residents. So in one part of the book, I did two simple calculations. One, to look at this good labor made cheap, and what's the dollar amount, right? There's no exact way to do this math, but a very simple way is you take this work from, I think, Yao Yang and not Yao Yang, Lu Feng and others on the wage difference between migrant labor and urban employees, and then you gave them a assumption. For instance, you say 25% of the wage difference is due to discrimination. Now, this number did not just come from my mind. I think a lot of studies have shown that you control for everything, migrants make 25% or even less. So if you apply that and then look at the wage difference over time, this is the amount I came up. It's about 72 to 290 billion US dollars saved because of the discriminatory policy of the Chinese system. So in other words, not only the first phase of industrialization without urbanization was built on the backs of Chinese peasants. The second phase, with the building up of China, it's the policy, the system made the Chinese labor cheap. And that benefited everyone, including themselves, right? But also not insignificantly the capitalists around the world. So that's China's cheap labor. And then by the same token, you can do a estimation of how urban population benefited from this. One of them is property boom, the value. And so I took Beijing and Shanghai, these two cities, and look at 2003 and 2013, and the same housing units prices. These are same housing units, not the new housing, and then same people in 2003. And you look at the appreciation of real estate prices, and then you divide that whole increase, the total amount, to the people who were in Beijing and Shanghai, local residents in 2003. And this is what I came up with, is for in Shanghai, every person, including an infant, okay, every person in Shanghai, just by being there, having that household registration, on average, you gained $75,000 in wealth, right? And in Beijing, that's over 100,000. So in other words, I mean, for people who are not familiar with this, it's the rural migrants in most cases could not buy property in Beijing and Shanghai, right? So they could not ride the same property boom wave as the local residents could. So you really have different path toward prosperity. I'll shift very quickly to surplus. So after this period of abundance, China has generated enormous amount of material surplus. And this work is based on the collaboration with Cai Yong here and Shen Ke at Fudan University. This is not in the book, but the book has similar stuff. So basically, if we take a one-way life cycle perspective, look at a person from birth to death, and a person go through a life cycle as dependent. So you have a life cycle deficit. The difference between income and the consumption is negative. You consume more, you don't make money, you don't have income. And at prime age, you produce more, you earn income than your consumption. So this is a surplus. And again, at old age, a person goes into a stage of what's called a deficit, life cycle deficit again. And this is the per capita curve that we calculated for the beginning of 2000 and then to the end of 2010s. And you look at how the surplus on per capita terms increased, but at the same time, deficit also increased because of increase in consumption. And this one is the aggregate. So you aggregate the population. And here we see how the surplus, total surplus increased in trillion RMBs. And you see how surplus increased rapidly up to the mid-2010s. And then in the last 5 years of the decade, the total surplus in China, in this way, we calculated, dropped substantially. And this is not because of income, this labor income continues to increase, but because of the rapid increase in private and public consumption. I know people are still talking about Chinese not consuming enough. That's only just one side of the story. People are consuming a lot. So in the early years, the increase in consumption was slower than increase in labor income, but that's not the case anymore. People started to spend money. So when that happens, this total surplus, this is still in the positive territory, right? $15 trillion back in 2018. I mean, not dollar, RMB. And so, but that is shrinking, surplus is shrinking. So if we project this forward, a lot of this is due to population aging. Okay, so this is the survival ratio. I mean, not dependency, support ratio. And this is the projection we did when the surplus would run out based on the 2010 profile. Based on the 2010 profile, when people were still saving more, consume much less, the total surplus could last, stay positive until the end of the century, but no longer the case because this rapid shift in consumption, the surplus could exhaust within 10 years. Cai Yong did this graph. Okay. again, we'll come back to the question of whether China is unique. In the last 40 years or so, we saw a real urbanization boom in China, right? I think the urbanization level is now higher than 63%, right? And at the same time, we saw income, per capita income, constant price increased by more than 11 times. You have urbanization, non-farming transformation, and you have income increase. So this is very easy to understand. The income per hour for a farmer is negligible. You cannot calculate, I mean, for a farmer, what's the income per hour? And when that farmer moves to a city, start to laying bricks or moving dirt, cement, and that hour rate is way, way more than what a farmer would make. So that's why you see the income increase when people move from rural areas to cities with this industrialization, right? This is what happened in China. But China is not the only one. You look at South Korea. South Korea went through this urbanization boom, right? And also a rapid income increase. And prior to South Korea, you have Japan, right? So what this tries to show is that what China has experienced is nothing more than industrialization with urbanization. Every other country went through the same process. So from the path to abundance to this path, just look at these comparisons. China is actually not that unique. It's going through the same thing. And I'll continue to say why this is the case. Okay, I need to go later. Okay. But China, as moving forward, faces several headwinds. So in the book, I pointed out a few. The first is on urbanization. China does not have just one urbanization. You know, this what we call the residential urbanization. China has 3 urbanizations. We all know China has the Foucault-based, what's called the social urbanization. And by 2020, only 45% of the population have local household registration. So that's about 260 million people. 18% of the population who live in places where they don't have the local household registration. Now, China has been making a lot of changes to make it easier for migrants to have the local status and to enjoy the same benefits, but not for cities over 5 million people, the mega cities. And the migrants in those cities account for over 200 million, right? So for China, it's not, okay, then there's this, the top line is what we call the employment urbanization. And if you look at 2010, China has only about 25% of the population who are still in what's called farming, right? But look at this. From the 2020 census, if you look at the young people, it's only about 10% of the young people who are still in farming. So when the Prime Minister Li Qiang said last month in Beijing, we still have 30% of the rural population could come into cities, not young people, right? So in other words, oops. This is not working. Okay. Too fast. Okay. How do I go back?
Let me try.
Oh, this one. This one goes back. This one goes back. Okay, good. All right. So if you look at this line, China does not have that many young people who would still move into cities. But if you look at the difference here, China has a lot of work to do to absorb these people, to make them the same citizens as the ones who have the local status. So that's why China does not have one urbanization, but has three urbanizations. And this is one of the challenges, the first challenge that China has to face in the years to come. The second one, of course, is with population aging. And this I took from a op-ed piece Tsai Ing and I wrote. And we did the calculation of the fiscal burden of the government. That's the share of GDP that will need to be spent on social benefits such as pension, healthcare, and education. Without any change in the benefit level, the increase, largely driven by population aging, would require about a quarter of China's GDP to be spent on these items. However, given China is a upper middle income society, and it's quite unthinkable that China can continue with the current fragmented and the low level of social benefits if they can adjust the level to the European, the OECD level back at the beginning of the 21st century by 2030. And this is what's going to happen, right? So basically, within a couple of decades, China would need to spend 25 to 30% of its GDP on these social benefits. Okay, this is inelastic. Okay, what does that mean? The total government revenue right now is about 25 to 30% of GDP right now. So if China does not increase taxes drastically, or its government revenue would have to spend on these items alone. So that's a tremendous political test for the people in Beijing. So this is not an easy task. And with aging, we also see this inevitable change. That's the composition of the cause of death. 30 years ago, less than half of all deaths were due to what we call the chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases. They are costly to care. They are long-lasting. And now China has over 70% of the deaths that are due to these causes, right? Population aging would only push the shift to a higher share of the death due to these non-communicable diseases, which clearly has healthcare cost implications. And I call that not getting rich before, getting old before getting rich. I call this getting old while getting rich, because you're eating so much more. I have numbers about hypertension, diabetes, this sudden increase in sudden change in dietary change. I won't spend much time on the third headwind, which is on inequality, right? I think I just need to point out that the latest number we have on wealth inequality in China, this was actually 10 years ago, is getting close to the US level back in the 2000s as well. So this wealth inequality, Gini index, right? One is perfect inequality, right? And wealth inequality has more implications than income inequality. They reset starting line for the members of the society. And here we're looking at a country that had, 30 years of capitalist history, and is getting close to a country that has over 200 years of capitalism. So China is really a country of vast inequality. So now I return to the four narratives I began earlier. The first is China is unique. So if you look at the Chinese process as just industrialization with urbanization, as you've seen, the comparison, China is not that unique. It's very similar to other economies that moved into industrial and post-industrial societies. And the Chinese labor was not just cheap, it was made cheap. It was good labor, right? For capitalists, you don't just go where cheap labor is the cheapest. It's a good labor, not the cheap. And China had good labor, and that cheap labor was made cheap by the Chinese social institutions. And the third one I think is very important, since this book is about abundance, about increasing standard of living. If you think of the three measures, the most important transformations in standard of living increase: food to eat, clothes to wear, and a house to live. They were the result in the respectively of household responsibility farming system, decollectivization, of TVEs, township and village enterprises, and our migrants going into cities. There's one common feature of all these three fundamental transformations affecting people's standard of living. None of them was government initiated. They all came from the initiatives from the bottom, and the government often constrain them before they embrace them. Think about the migration control policies, right? Think about the TVEs. So there's no discounting of the important reforms and the policies, institutions building. They're tremendously important. Building market economy. But if you look at how people's lives were changed, these were all local ground up initiatives. So I think we need a correction there in terms of the narratives. The academics like to write about reforms, policies, proposals, but this is not how things happened. If you look at how people's lives were affected. I began the book with a chapter called Surprise. Now I want to end with this, which is really we need to be cautionary on when we make predictions about what happened in the future. Well, first of all, the Chinese leaders, successful leaders, they all underestimated, actually, including Deng Xiaoping, how much the economy was going to grow. Right? They missed by 25%, 27%, and then by almost 30%. Hu Jintao, they said, we're going to double, and then it's much more than double. So they didn't quite have a clue. And not better for the world's most renowned economists. So in 2004, the Wall Street Journal convened 12 Nobel Prize winning economists and asked them to predict, not in 10 years, not in 30 years, not in 50 years, but in 75 years, by 2079, which economy is going to be the largest? United States, EU, or China? 12 economists. And so this is what they said. Basically, half of them, 6 of them, were sure or not quite sure. Well, 6 of them were not sure China would be the largest economy by 2079. Okay. Here we have our Janet Yellen's husband, Eckloff, says, I think the current gap between China, US, and EU probably too large to make up, right? So the most cautionary person was a local one.
Is this per capita?
Total size. Yeah, they also asked for Oops, oh no, this one goes. I can't just tell you what. They also asked for per capita. I think most of them said per capita, no way. But the overall, the size, the EU, US, EU, US, 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 and Stiglitz. So 2001, Stiglitz just finished his term as the chief economist of the World Bank. So he went to China a lot of times. So he's more kind of aware of what's happening. But he basically gave this answer, says, oh, it's too hard to make a projection 75 years from now, correct? And then he said, oh, the growth is, what do you say, even growth doesn't remain, So basically it's likely that it will be different. He didn't say which one is going to be ahead, right? But here's what happened. If you use PPP, purchasing power parity, by the IMF actually announced in 2014, the Chinese economy was larger than the US. The economy was asking for 2079. And I just checked 2 days ago, in 2022, this is by the World Bank, and the Chinese economy was about 20% larger than the US, right? So not all economists, Nobel Prize winning economists were so pessimistic. And here is Robert Fogel, before he passed away in 2010. And he said the Chinese economy was going to grow 10.8% for 30 years. And by 2040, the Chinese economy is going to be 40% the size of the total world economy. And it's interesting that he just not, this is in foreign affairs, not just gave this very optimistic projection, but also he listed 4 favorable conditions. So here I highlight number 3. And he wrote in 2010 that China has a open political system, right? And so just last month, and Xi Jinping, in greeting these foreign businessmen in Beijing, said China did not collapse as predicted by the China collapse theory, correct? Nor will it peak as forecasted by the China peak theory. I don't know. I actually have a debate with a close friend about what's the meaning of peak. Whether peak is the total size, which means if it's peak, then China starts shrink, or peak by growth rate. By growth rate, I think the moment Xi Jinping took over, it peaked, right? It keeps going down. So it's still debatable whether, what is this peak theory. But let me get back to this. So you saw these industrialization with urbanization. This is what happened in Japan. So after increasing by more than tenfold, after 1981, economic growth rate, per capita income growth rate, GDP growth rate was about 1.5%. South Korea, which seems to have very dynamic economy, is no more than 3%, right? So why would China continue to grow at 10.8 or 8% by Chinese economist Justin Ling? There are certain gravitational forces. I think one nice paper by Ai-Ching Green and colleagues listed well. When the economy grows to upper higher income level, you have other sorts of forces that are not escapable. So the question is whether China can escape these, what I call the gravitational forces, to continue 6%, right? Look at the other countries. If China is not that unique, we know what's happening. So to get to the end, was China's age of abundance inevitable? I think in the book, I think it's China was extremely lucky to have this happy marriage of three factors. That's one, people. It's the large, healthy, literate, hardworking rural population transforming into cities. And one, history, that was the painful Cultural Revolution that really made the whole society want to move into a different direction. And it's very important to have one person, which is Deng Xiaoping. Without the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping would not have done things that he has done, right? And he would not be able to mobilize the party elite to make this sudden shift. So in other words, there are many what ifs that could have set China to a different route. I listed some in the book. For instance, after 1989, at age of 87 in 1992, Deng Xiaoping was just too tired, did not go to Shenzhen, right? Or Deng Xiaoping did not handpick two sets of leaders who governed for 20 years. So the power struggle would not just start 10 years ago, could be 20 years ago, right? What if 9/11 had not happened on the soil of the United States, right? What if China did not concede to the conditions for the negotiation for WTO? So any of the single ones could have set China to a different route. So when we look back at history, I really think China was very lucky to have had this set of conditions which are not repeatable, right? And this is my last slide. So how do we look at this age of abundance, right? I think looking back, China had 4 decades of material abundance, but without a true cultural renaissance. About 10, 15 years ago, Larry Summers listed the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of China as the 3 most important events of the last millennium, right, last 1,000 years. But if you compare the rise of China to these other 2 great events, it's very different. Well, China had its Renaissance, Enlightenment in the 1980s, but that's no longer the case. So China has had a tremendous material wealth boom, but unfortunately, here I quote, this is about enlightenment, okay, that preceded, and industrialization came with the Enlightenment. And the idea of political power as a social contract, formal limits on the executive branch, freedom of expression, intellectual constability, religious tolerance, basic human legal rights, the realization that exchange was a positive sum game, the virtuousness of economic activity and trade, this sanctity of property rights, and the folly of mercantilist notions that place the state, not the individual, as the ultimate object of society. So these were the spirits of enlightenment. China had all these discussions, enlightenment in the 1980s. But at the end of, as China exits the age of abundance, we don't see the signs of these. So in other words, it's some people call this as a soulless express, right? So China had a great material abundance without a true renaissance. And this is the last graph I included in the book because I used a lot of the statistics to plot measures of standard living, this and that. So I thought I should plot this. This is in 1981 when China started publish the statistic facts. It published the number of publications that each year because the state controls the publication, and also the number of pages that's printed. So here's the late 1950s. I think this is by Hua Qifang. So you have the peak of the number of publications and also the pages read per person. And of course, after the anti-rightist movement, both the number of publications and the pages read per person dropped to a very low level. And then you saw an interesting change, that is the number of publications dropped to the lowest point, but pages per person read peaked up to that point. You know what happened? In the 1960s, everybody was reading the little red book, right? So you don't have many publications, but people are reading, printed a lot. Small pages. And then see what happened after 1978. It's both the sharp increase in the number of books and also the number of pages people start to read. Now, I don't have the data. I think a lot of people are doing research of what happened lately, but this just to show that China had its short period of enlightenment and that the market of ideas helped China to produce the market of goods. And that era seems to be coming to an end. So I'm sorry to end on that tone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wang Feng. I think, yeah, we can end the slideshow and you can please join the table. So we have 30 minutes for questions and dialogue. So for people who are online, please type in the Q&A box and I will select the questions. For people who are in person, please get a microphone. I'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much. Congratulations again for your recent prize and recognition.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. Thank you for coming.
We're old friends. 3 questions. You use PPP data, which I support. I agree with. But why does the Chinese government, in your opinion, not tout the PPP data? Why does the Chinese government still promote a picture of itself as playing a catch-up game in terms of overall economic size? That's question 1. Question 2, you said that the common rhetoric around China's economic performance, at least journalistically speaking, is that China needs to consume more, that China's not consuming much. It's just a sort of big surplus producing nation. And there's certainly a lot of that kind of writing. Is it your view that the consumption that needs to the additional consumption that needs to take place is essentially Social Security related spending? In other words, healthcare and the things that you talked about for the diseases of affluence and the problems of upper middle class and wealthier societies. And then the third question is, and I'm sorry to pile on here, but the third question is about the hukou system. You talked about the political challenges that China faces in terms of raising revenue to support social welfare costs. But how do you explain the reticence of the system to smash the hukou system, or to at least, if not dramatically smash the hukou system, put things on a faster timeline toward emergence out of the hukou system?
Thank you, Howard. For years, I just read your reports from China, and we all learned, and we're grateful. For the first question, I don't really know. I think it's been a decade. The Chinese economy measured by PPP is larger than the United States. On the one hand, I think the Chinese leaders like to say how great China is and how strong it is. I think on this aspect, I agree with you. I think they are deliberately trying to not to claim to be the largest, the strongest. I suspect that's the case. I won't be surprised that, again, I'm not making silly, predictions. The Chinese economy is actually more than 20% larger than the U.S. economy, right? These PVP is still pretty general. Yes, consumption. There are two different types of consumptions we're talking about. One is the kind that the work Cai Yong, Shen Ke, and we did, and look at just consumption versus income, and then look at the surplus. But the consumption that I think is generally discussed is really the consumption that would actually propel the increase in production as well, to generate demand, right? So it's not a net zero-sum game. And then more importantly, I think you're absolutely right. It's not just consumption of spending money, but how do you generate more consumption in the society? I think there are two aspects to this. One is they're related. One is to increase, and people talk about this. This is not new idea, about providing better general social benefits, and people feel more secure, like pension, healthcare. They don't have to, prepare for the worst catastrophe to pay for health expenses, and they would be more confident to spend more. So that's general, and relatedly is really the issue of inequality. And China has so many rich people, right? They are investing, they are generating more bubbles in the market, and they're not, well, they're spending, but not the kind of spending that the majority of the population are spending. So there's really a issue of, there are two sets of issues. One is the distribution between the state and then household income. I think Carl knows this so well. For years, the increase in household income was below the GDP growth rate, and then the government revenue was way above the general GDP growth rate. Was actually at a certain time twice. The government revenue was increasing 20% per year. That's when China had all these different initiatives, right, spending money. So there was that distribution between the state and the household, and also between the rich and the poor. So, so consumption is not just a generic term of people spending more money. It's really how do you make the changes? And that leads to your third question. That's why can they do more about the household registration system? I have two takes on this. Okay, one is factual, and then the other is speculative. The factual one is, if you look at the Chinese physical arrangement, 50% of the revenue comes from local government, and 50% is from the central government. But if you look at the spending, 90% it's local. So if you're in Shanghai, the local government is paying for most of the benefits. So the Shanghai government would not be able to allow people to come in. So it's the physical arrangement that makes it very, very hard for cities to welcome others to come in. I think there are some cases like Xi'an or Chengdu, they say, you come to buy our apartments and we'll give you hukou. But overall, and we have actually studies showing how the per student expenditure in Shanghai is how many times of that of in Henan. So it's that, I think that makes it really hard as China moves forward. When the economy was growing fast, when government revenue was coming in at a rapid rate, you can solve a lot of problems just by giving money to everybody, but that's no longer the case. And so I think that's more factual, but I also have something that's more speculative, it's observational. We always talk about, the strong, the powerful Chinese government, but what the government can do? Spend money. They can 办大事. The 办大事 is they spend money, but they look at hukou, look at property tax, look at retirement age. People have been talking about this for years, and they just can't do them. And so when it comes to the real, like software, structural changes, policy changes, it's very slow. I mean, the thing that I'm most familiar with, Joan is here, the one-child policy. It lasted for 35 years. It just couldn't end it earlier. But if it comes to spending money to build, chip factories or to build new airports and to 一带一路, so they can really do it. So my sense, with Hukou is the government is actually very incapable of making hard, real changes.
Yeah, speaking of the one-child policy, no, I'm totally agree with you that part of China's story was an educated and healthy population. But I wonder if you could comment on what part reduced fertility played in that healthier population, because unlike many countries with the same level of economic growth, the later, longer, fewer campaign in the 70s brought the TFR so far down even before the reform and opening up began. So, I mean, even though it was more in the rural areas, that was a big factor in reduced infant and child mortality, and the healthier population. And people look at Africa right now and say, oh, you should do the China model. The demographic dividend will contribute. Africa is going to be the next China, right? But I think, those parallels are never well teased out. So I just wanted to ask you to comment on what part did population control, for better or for worse, play in China's economic juggernaut in the 80s, especially.
Thank you, Joan. I can give you exact number, 15%.
Why am I not surprised?
No, history is just such a collection of events. I think China, I listed only three, one people, one history, and one person. China benefited from a demographic dividend and also came at the right time. I think there's huge misunderstanding, thinking a lot of young people, it's a demographic dividend. That's a potential. The dividend is when people are employed, when they can do things. So had China not had the, here I have to say, reform, the opening in the 1980s, the large number of young people born after the Great Leap for the famine would have extreme difficulty to find jobs. But then decollectivization came, they could do household farming. And then you have the rise of TVEs, they could go into the rural industries. So China did benefit from, if I have to add, that's part of the one people. I think China did benefit just at the right time. But I think historically so convenient. Yeah, absolutely, it's important. There is a calculation. It was 15% between 1982 and 2000. I wasn't joking. Yeah.
Betty and Paul, I thought I could challenge the last question.
Abundance without a renaissance. Abundance without the Renaissance. It seems over those years, if we think of Renaissance as a change in worldview, connection to the outside world, so the arc of my own career, there's been a Renaissance. I mean, the number in millions of people with different perspectives and different view of the world. And it wasn't just in the big cities. I felt that doing the field work in Yunnan in 2004, the high school teachers that we worked with, I think their worldview is quite transformed. But maybe if I went back now, I'd find there's this regression. But it seems that Renaissance in this largest sense, not just the political specific things you highlighted and tied to enlightenment, gives us more hope. Because if we believe, as I do and you do, about change from the bottom up, then the change is there. because the bottom has, as we would say demographically, is so transformed intellectually.
Well, certainly, Debbie, I would agree with you that the mentality, the mental frame of Chinese people now are very different from what they are 40 years ago, even 10 years ago. But it's all how we define Renaissance. If we're looking at the sense of humanity, the sense of not the Western type of individualism, but in the respect for individuals and the pursuit of art, freedom. There's that element, but the whole, the society as whole, if you look at the cultural production, it's all palaces, rebuilt palaces, super operas of emperors. It's all the stuff not about individual enlightenment. So, my sense, and actually, I quote the historian Brondel, and that's not what the Renaissance was about. It's very different. The cultural, the palaces that's been built, it's not an expression of art. It's expression of national history, pride, stuff like that. So it's how we look at what's Renaissance, right? Yeah.
How and
Wang Feng, I'm glad that you emphasized the problem of inequality, because when that graph appeared showing China having luxury spending entirely out of whack with its average per capita living standard, that was a sure sign of gross inequality, a lot of spending at the top. The phrase age of abundance, it sounds like it has an end to it. It suggests that your proposition is that China has reached a particular position which cannot indefinitely be maintained. And one additional factor in the equation is, of course, environmental problems, which are huge. But you didn't actually say that, and I'm just curious. We asked you to prognosticate a little bit.
Yeah.
Are you pessimistic about China's economic future in the next 50 years?
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl. That's a great question. I think I have to define what's the age of abundance. It doesn't mean that Chinese is to become poor, right? If we say abundance is a material abundance, I don't think it's going to go away. I mean, in that sense, I'm not pessimistic. And so in the book, I do say this is the rapid, the growth, the period of rapid growth, that kind of abundance. So prosperity is very likely to continue. I think what's really great is that in the last 40 years, through hard working, through a lot of good luck and mostly hard working, that the standard of living for such a large share of humanity just moved up a whole different level. I don't see how that's going to go down. So in that sense, I agree with Cai Yong. China has not peaked. It's not like it's going to shrink. So in that, I'm pretty confident. But whether they're going to have 5%, 6% growth rate, I don't think so. Right? They can, right? During the planned economy time, and also just first quarter this year, you can have rapid growth rate. It's just by having a lot of what's called the contentless growth investment. You have a lot of activity, generate a lot of output. Under socialism, we had a lot of that. It's not useful. People are not benefiting, right? But real growth, 3% is quite decent. And China has reached that era where this per capita income level And so 3% is not shabby. It's shabby in terms of the government revenue because the government really needs to have a high share of revenue increase to maintain what's being built and what needs to be spent. So I would say again, I think the age of abundance is really this age of rapid increase in standard of living, transformative, right? But it's not. So the affluence is not going away, even though it's very unequal. And so China it's a rich country now. And people
3% is even better with a declining population.
right.
per
Yeah,
capita
exactly.
terms.
So it could be more than per capita could be more than 3%. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I was late and missed the first 10 minutes of your talk, stuck in the traffic driving from Syracuse. I want to going back to Debbie's question of Renaissance, coming from the different perspective, using the word, I think you have mentioned in your slides, compressed industrialization, or some people call that compressed modernity. What do you think does that very rapid or much more rapid rate of growth and abundance have on Chinese society, especially Chinese people's mindsets? Just give you some context here. I have a doctoral student who is working on mental health crisis in China. And you can see that, you know, the huge social inequality, how people are really so painfully struggling against this materialistic pursuits. So just want to hear from you about your thoughts about this impact of compressed modernity on the psychic mentality. Yeah, if I think if Chinese people are struggling in terms of their emotional states, that's definitely not a part of Renaissance story, I guess.
Great question. Let me try to answer this by answering a different question that I get all the time, which is why young people in China are not getting married and not having children. You know, they get a question like that all the time. This is, I think people talk about high cost of having children, getting married. It's not just the absolute cost, it's really expectation. I think in all three societies, East Asian societies, especially, and including Taiwan economy, and especially mainland China, because of this very compressed growth period, people were so used to 10%, 8% increase in salary income year after year, right? And so for young people getting into the labor market, getting a job now, unlike their parents or grandparents, the cost of living for them was low because they had housing and didn't have to drive a car. So the starting point is very different. So for young people entering the society, the cost base is high, but they don't have 6, 8, 10% salary increase year after year. So when the economy is slowing down in the last 10 years, and there was this big adjustment between the expectation they're so used to and the reality, I think that has a pretty severe impact, because if you look at the absolute standard of living, they're not living poorer than in the past. The cost is not higher, that much higher. So it's really, I think there's a lot of this to do with expectation. I think that, I can't say despair, but that disappointment with the gap between reality and expectation, and that feeds back to somewhat to mental health. There are other issues with mental health as well. But I think expectation, this, you know, this is like the morning after, right? The morning after fast growth, it takes a while to adjust. That's just my take for answer for a different question, but I think.
There's a question from the online audience about the role of politics or political systems played in this. Part of it is hukou, which you mentioned already. Actually, this audience member quotes Professor Qin Hui, who refers to the hukou system as the low human rights advantage. And then also, can you speculate or discuss the potential impacts of other political factors, such as 1989, such as other transformations of political leaders? Do you think that plays a role, or how would that play a role going forward?
First of all, I think I did not use the word of the phrase of what's called the advantage of
Low human rights.
low human rights advantage. I did not use the exact phrase, but I think the idea is exactly the same. It's good labor made cheap, right? So it's and that's where the cheap labor came from. I think for all economies that underwent the urbanization, migration, newcomers always have to endure certain discrimination, right? But it's different in the Chinese case. It's so systematic and it's so long lasting, right? So I think that's the difference. So in terms of that part, I'm totally in agreement with Professor Qin Hui's writing and phrasing of this feature. Politics plays an enormous important role, especially in a authoritarian regime, as in China. And political power is so centralized. And there are numerous examples. So having a person like Deng Xiaoping, regardless how, or what do we say about his great achievements and shortcomings, the fact that this one person could make that huge difference, it just shows you the politics and also that system. And the same thing that we're observing now in the last 10 years, just how enormously a power a person could amass and could exercise, right? I did not write about this in my book because I did not want to write a book to be read just for now or for the next 5 years. Well, I think as every author would have this wish that sometime down the road, someone picks up this book and said, "Oh, it's still relevant." So because it's economic history, so it's social history. So I did not mention this, but politics is enormously important.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. I'm thinking about something that you didn't speak about in something in a talk that covered everything in the world in so many ways, but that is our beloved country, the United States. And it seems to me that in terms of thinking through the question of whether China has had it, essentially, it's reached what it can do. One of the crucial issues, in fact, remains the fundamental shift, one of several shifts in U.S.-China relations, but now from positive to negative, some from welcoming China to the World Trade Organization, from transforming American capitalism by sending a lot of it out to China. Apple is a pretty good example, and so forth. I'm just wondering whether, in fact, you think the change in U.S.-China relations is a fundamental factor that precludes a China continue to make the kinds of economic and consumption and power breakthroughs of this decade. The other question I wanted to raise, we talked hukou to death, and many of us are concerned about it. But in the end, I don't see a satisfactory explanation about why China cannot, in fact, come to terms with the hukou, having gone as far as it has. And the data you present shows the rapid increase in urban population and its crucial role in Chinese economy and so on. To me, it still remains a bit of a mystery why China is unable to break through. So you talk about the cities of 5 million as a key. That obviously is one of the concerns. But is there more of an explanation why, having gone this far, this should remain, I think, still a major obstacle to China's breakthrough?
Thank you, Mark. Talk about Hukou, we always cite the Sheldon and the Chen that piece on Hukou, right? Let me try to answer the second one first. I think it's easier. The first one is just very large. I would say, to put it very briefly, is as in any other economies or societies, is 没有钱, is run out of money. What they need to do, for instance, they could have a national social security system that provides a not fancy but adequate level of support for all elderly. That's done at the national level. So the central government, the local government, they cannot ask local government to do this because it's, yeah. So, and also to have national healthcare system, even the United States has something like that. But in order to do that, well, we have social security. But in order to do that, you cannot lower the level of the people who are getting the good benefits now. You can you can raise like the 90 RMB, 120 RMB per month rural elderly to something like 5,000. You need money to do that, right? Well, China can have national ID, they have all the stuff. So they can start with this central government, national uniform, adequate social benefit programs. But seriously, I think they don't have the money to do this. It would take a lot of other ways to do this. That, I mean, that's my very sympathetic take on this. It's hopeless to rely on local communities, local cities to do this, right? Now, the first question is a great one. And actually, we have to look back. I think China, in terms of this happy historical era, China really benefited from a good relationship with the United States. A lot of support. I'm looking at myself. I came to graduate school without paying a penny, right? I'm not a very useful person because I don't make 5mm chips. I studied demography. I'm useless. But you know, there are so many people who are trained by this country. That's just one example, right? And I keep thinking why people did not do a study of the 2008 financial crisis in this country and linking that to the cheap goods coming from China, right? It's just the credit, the cheap goods coming from China really benefit the Chinese laborers, but also I think in some ways, I just feel like it also contributed to the bubble in this country, this part. So in many ways, we can talk about numerous ways, from technology to institutions, like how the Chinese learn how to do census, that I know, to do demographic analysis. So from many aspects, America was a very generous country, opened up its arms at different levels, embraced China. But you know, Americans are human beings, and it's hard to see another country that's as powerful as your country, or is it even more powerful? So I do think in terms of US-China relations, it's because of China's rise as economic power, and also its certain political behavior of its leaders, of how to learn to adapt to this new world, and then the reactionary responses of this country, these people and certain leaders, politicians, that I think have locked US, China in this difficult position. I'm not optimistic. I don't think this is something that through a change of administration or leaders, they can make things slightly better. But ultimately, the United States has never learned how to accommodate with another big power. And China, you were saying this compressed growth, this lack of renaissance, I think the time is too short for China to learn to be this great world power or leader. So this kind of learning adaptation process, I think it's going to last way beyond the youngest people in this room. So I think it's certainly going to affect what China is, but it's really structural. I don't see it,
We have to end here. I apologize to some online questions we couldn't get to. You can always write to Professor Wang Feng to engage in a discussion, and I encourage you all to get a copy of the book. Thank you so much, Professor Wang. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.